There's plenty of room in the front. And we hope you don't get stiff necks with your bifocals, those of you who've got bifocals. This is the first, Bill Loader's my name, by the way. I think most of you know who I am. I was Professor of New Testament at Murdoch University, and I taught in the Uniting Church College over there for, well, 40 years. And I'm now a retired professor, which really doesn't mean a lot, except that I'm slowing down a little bit, and people might tell me to slow down as I become more forgetful. But that's not quite happening yet. So we're going to talk about God, and I'm going to do it historically, how people have understood God over the years. So I'm going to go back through Old Testament material and New Testament and through to today. As people from Orange, you know what OMG stands for? The Orange Motor Group, of course. But of course it's often used as a shorthand for oh my God, in which case the God part actually is meaningless. I mean, it really, for most people, it doesn't mean a thing. Oh my gosh, you'd say, oh heck, oh my God, wow, sort of saying the same kind of thing. But God talk, religious language is, it's not scientific, it's not rational in a sense. It's more like the language of love. So it's got a lot of images and it'll be inaccurate. It comes more out of the heart than out of the head. And we need to respect that when we're using language about God. And I think we need to be very tolerant. If I tried to use the word God only in ways that I think are really okay, I mightn't be saying God very much. And if I sang only hymns that I felt have really captured, what's got intellectual integrity, I would sing very few hymns. But I sing, O worship the King, all glorious above. I don't like the image of king. In the ancient world, it was really a rather oppressive image. And all glorious above, well, it reminds me of when you score a try in rugby league or rugby. Have you seen them do it? They score the try and then they go like that. Seen them do that? Yeah. And people on the other side of the planet do the same thing. So some of them are pointing to God there, and some of them are pointing to God there, like it's meaningless. But that's the way it is with religious language, and we need to have a level of tolerance that when we use God language and religious language, we're actually expressing something more from our heart than from our head. And that's not inappropriate. I want to say that I want to affirm faith. I mean, precisely because talking about God is language coming out of your heart more than out of your head, we are existentially, personally involved in language about God. So we can't just treat a discussion about God as an intellectual conversation. It actually matters to us. In fact, when I was preparing to put this lecture together, I thought, should I do it? Because I'm going to talk about things that are deeply personal for you and for me. For me, it's fundamental to my life. My connectedness with God is about me being human. And I work on that. It matters. And so if you're touching on things that are really personal to me, there will be some levels of sensitivity. At the same time, our talk about God is human talk. These are human ideas about God. And they're all going to be inadequate. And it's important to look at them from time to time and recognize that some of them are really healthy and some of them are really unhealthy. So I want to take you on a journey on people's understanding of God, how they've thought about God down through the centuries. Thank God we won is another one of these ones like OMG. Thank God we won. Like the God part there's got no relevance, largely. It's probably just an expression of relief. Wow, thank God we got that done. Of course, in the ancient world, it would be seen more as a fact claim. We won the battle because our God or our gods on our side beat the other gods. We beat their gods. That's how it would have been understood. And the assumption was that gods in the ancient world controlled events and battles and who won and who didn't. So everything was played out in people's minds in terms of gods. When you think about it, in the ancient world, they had much less sense of control than we have, so they felt really vulnerable, and part of expressing that vulnerability was to say, we're in the lap of the gods. Yeah? That's how they thought about things. Gods control, and so nations, peoples would have their gods. I've got my gods and you've got your gods. You live in a different land. And that might seem strange to us, but it wasn't in those days. Gods were localized to particular places. So there's an Old Testament story about Naaman, the Syrian commander, who came and got healed of leprosy. And he was so pleased that he got a couple of truckloads of earth from Judea and took it back to where he lived in Syria because he wanted to have a bit of God, Yahweh, Israel's God, with him. It's strange to us, but it's how they thought about things in those times. And so things like the rain and the sun and the wind, as well as what happens to people, is all controlled by gods and spirits. That was the assumption. God help us, we lost. Again, it's one of those statements that the God part really, is irrelevant. It's again an expression of, despair or disappointment. God help us. It can, of course, in the ancient world, be understood as our God didn't help us. So we lost the battle. Their gods were stronger. And that's why we lost. Or we did something and our God didn't approve of us, and therefore our battle went against us. And quite often conflict was projected into the world of the gods. So not only were nations being at war, but the gods of those nations were at war. The ancient understanding was that each nation had its god. And so there was a bit of a conflict going on up there, which played itself out down here. Gods at war. Or maybe we lost because our God was displeased with us. We need to placate our local God. So in a world where there are their gods and our gods, it's a bit chaotic. It's often, as I've said, the conflicts between the gods reflected conflicts between people. And if you read ancient texts, you find that a lot of what went on between the gods and their children was very much like what goes on in conflict within households. Like it was all projected into the divine world, so the same kind of behaviours took place, same kind of jealousies, same kind of alliances, all of that. As people moved out of their valley, out of their little cluster, out of their isolation, the more they had contact with other nations, the effect of that was to relativize the assumptions they had about themselves. You don't understand what I mean? It's like, like when people go overseas, they realize, oh my gosh, not everything's like Australia. The connection, a transnational awareness, a transcultural awareness does things. And so one of the things it did was to cause people to say, so, okay, our God how does our God relate to their gods? Is our God better? You know, they had to sort of work out that. Is there a hierarchy among the gods? Is there a chief god? Those are things that really bothered people. What you find is that a number of cultures, and this included in Israel, would talk about the gods met together in council. It's a little bit like politics. You know, there's a cabinet or there's a parliament. There's a gathering of gods, and they sort of sort things out. Now, this is all strange to us, but it is a background to a number of the things that have kept on being said, and of course they have implications for us as we go on to think about God. One of the things you needed to do was to please the gods by sacrifice, giving them gifts, and also doing what they want, doing what they saw as good. This is a standard understanding of how you relate to gods, whether you're in Israel or in Syria or in Assyria or in Egypt. This was the way it went. And the belief was that if you pleased the gods, if you're good, you would prosper, and if you weren't good, you wouldn't. And so from Proverbs, is a collection of kind of wise sayings that have been passed down through the centuries, and amongst them you do get this notion, and I quote here, "Misfortune pursues sinners, but prosperity rewards the righteous." Think that one through. So if you're a good person, you're going to be wealthy, you're going to succeed. And if you're a wicked person, you're not going to. And if you're a person who doesn't have wealth, there's something wrong with you. You're bad, actually, because only good people are wealthy and succeed. Now, this is there in Proverbs, it's there in thinking in early Israel, and in what we call the Deuteronomistic histories. That's to say, the book of Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, the Samuels, 1st and 2nd Kings. The histories of Israel were edited by editors who believed this. And you may remember, if you've read those recently, that you'd have situations where Israel was defeated by its neighbours, the Philistines or somebody else, and then they repented and they did what was right and they won the battle the next time. And the whole history is panned out, you know, set out as though it's a success-failure thing. If you're good, if you do God's will, God will help you win. If you don't, you'll lose, your enemies will win. It was a neat system, but is it true? Of course, Israel had to struggle with this because they realized that that doesn't actually add up. One of the great things about the collection of Jewish writings which form the Old Testament is that the censorship didn't go so far as to say, let's make sure they all agree with each other and there's consistency here. What they did was to say, no, let's be inclusive. And so in the Old Testament writings, you've got a collection of points of view, including points of view about God. And that's a big block of material, the history part, in the Old Testament that has that point of view. What Israel did was to conclude, and I suppose there are other nations who concluded this too, conclude that their God was the supreme God. Yahweh was the name used for God. It may mean something like he is that he is, but it's an ancient name. So the God of Israel is actually the senior God, and the other gods are the junior gods. There's a hierarchy. And in the book of Psalms, you have some really old poetry, and one of them says, God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. That's interesting, isn't it? I mean, so there's a council of the gods, and Yahweh is the key god, the main god. It's an interesting development. Israel's God is the only God. Now, it's really interesting because one of the words for God is Elohim. It's also a plural form, gods, Elohim. But that word can also mean angels. And so what happened in Israel is that they said, well, now, sometimes they did refer directly to the others as gods still, as in that psalm. But sometimes they used Elohim and understood it more as angels. So God is God, and under God are angels. Like the other gods have been demoted, and they're now being called angels. They're under God's control. And what Israel did, and this is really interesting, what they did, they had legends and stories about their forebears, Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. And there's a lot of research that's been done about these. These are old traditions. They were key traditions. They were, you know, like tribal groups will tell stories about their ancestors. We think that they probably are related, but others think, well, maybe Isaac was the head person in one particular clan and Abraham in another, and at some stage the story got told so that Isaac was the son of Abraham. We're not sure about some of these things, but they were certainly told for the purposes of identity. But then what happens when you've got an understanding of God as the God over the gods, and you get this transnational awareness, you get priests who are writing up this stuff thinking, hang on, it's not just our God over our nation, superior to the other nations and their gods. Our God must actually be behind it all. And so what they did, and it was a later development, but a very significant development, in the collection of their ancient traditions, they placed a number of stories right at the beginning which talked about creation. That's to say the whole earth, the whole flat earth, had been made by our God. And so Genesis 1 to 11, you have a number of stories. They're actually ancient myths that are drawn largely from the surrounding cultures, like the story of Noah, the story of Babel, how languages came about, all of those kind of things. But they're given a kind of a treatment. They're given a treatment by the priests who wrote the first 11 chapters of Genesis, which touch on some very profound things. Like they are mythical at one level. We know that languages didn't come about because of the Tower of Babel. We know we've got other explanations for why there is poor soil, for why women have difficulty in childbirth and can't produce the finished product the way most mammals can. We understand how those things came about, but these were ancient stories that they picked up and they used, and while we don't get very far taking them literally, they say some profound things, like things go wrong when you overstep the limits, Adam and Eve story. Things go wrong when you try to make a name for yourself, the Tower of Babel. Communication breaks down. So those are very valuable stories, but they were put at the beginning of Israel's traditions to help cement the sense that our God isn't just the God of Israel, our God is the God of the earth, of heaven and earth. If this is the case, and of course in a sense this is behind the faith that we share. If this is the case, then there is an issue about suffering. One of the models, and we saw that in talking about the Deuteronomy books, is called the covenant model, where you get rewarded if you're good, you get punished if you're bad. So suffering is the result of you being bad. Health is the result of you being good. God will give you fertility if you're good, victory over your enemies, and if you don't, you won't have fertility, you won't have fruit, you won't have victory over your enemies. God gives victory and withholds victory. Now this, you can see this is it's not an irrational conclusion. It seems to be a reasonable conclusion if everything's under God's control, as they were thinking. And there was a generous repair mechanism. If you did stuff up, then you could go back and offer a sacrifice and repent, and you'd get the covenant back again. Like associated with that was this notion that God is forgiving. And that's a profound insight that we still hold on to, but you can see in part it arose because they were convinced it can't be that God would simply abandon his people. There must be hope in some way. And so in the book of Joshua we read, if you forsake the Lord, serve foreign gods, then he will turn and do you harm and consume you after having done you good. Now that's the philosophy of God, the understanding of God that's in these texts. There's a growing, emerging thinking about God, and part of it is really to do with the theme that we're looking at, namely, how does God and suffering, how do God and suffering relate? The prophets, it's a very interesting development because, let me quote you. By the way, that's the smallest font. You're able to read it back there, all right? Oh, good, good. So with what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings and calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He's told you, O mortal, what's good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God? What's happening here is a kind of retuning going on, that actually what God wants is a particular kind of priority given to human caring. Now that's an advance. It's still tied up in the old system, but it's an advance which many of us, of course, have greatly valued. So the prophetic challenge to people was that God values justice more than worship. But it's the same theism, the same understanding of God. It's the reward and punishment covenant model. God gives victory over enemies, provides need, fertility, all that kind of thing, if Israel keeps true worship. But now true worship is given an ethical, bit of ethical content. Otherwise, God gives victory to enemies, withholds blessings, and again, there's a healthy repair mechanism built into that covenant understanding. This system that says, do good and God will cause you to win and prosper and be healthy. Do evil and God will punish you, make you sick. Your enemies will defeat you and your land won't produce fruit. This, of course, over time didn't work. And so people had to grapple with it because there were wicked nations who won battles. And so you get people like Jeremiah the prophet pointing this out. Somehow it needs rethinking. One of the solutions was to say, well, it must work out okay for the good. And the wicked must be punished. It's just not going to happen now. It's going to happen in the future. Just wait. Wait and see. So the solution gets postponed. I mean, that's part of a solution. It's one of the ways they thought about it. So the righteous sometimes suffer and the wicked sometimes prosper, but wait, soon their punishment will come and your reward will come. And so you've got Psalm 13, how long must I bear pain in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all day long? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me? Please sort it out soon. You can see this, there's a kind of justice driving this. It's got to be sorted out, but it was taking time and people had to think about it like that. Another was to say, well, really, some of the suffering we experience, it's not our fault. You know, it's not our fault. And of course, they could use the Genesis story to say, well, yeah, it's Adam and Eve's fault, or Eve's fault. Somehow we're bearing the punishment for what happened a long time ago. Ezekiel knows this is a solution and challenges it and says, well, in those days they shall no longer say, as they were saying in his day, the parents have eaten sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge. That's that philosophy, you know. We're suffering because of what our parents did. Now there's some wisdom in that, of course. But Ezekiel says, all shall die for their own sins, and the teeth of everyone who eats sour grapes shall be set on edge. So what you're seeing here is they're still grappling with this notion of what justifies suffering. You can't put it off and say it's somebody else's fault. You've got to take some responsibility yourself, but this is not a solution. But the understanding is still that God somehow ordered it. So God caused the suffering you've got, even though it's a bit complicated now to explain exactly why, because it might have been your parents' fault. The Book of Job is of great significance as a piece of literature, because in the Book of Job you have a kind of fantasy about this whole issue of suffering. In fact, he has dialogue partners who offer all the answers we've been looking at so far. So what you have in the Book of Job is this, and again I'm going to read this. One day the heavenly beings, the angels, formerly the gods, came to present themselves before the Lord. This is the notion of a divine council meeting. And the Satan, we're used to the word Satan as I'm fading in and out a little bit. Yeah. Might be the microphone. I'll just carry on. We're used to the word Satan as a name. It's actually a description. It means the prosecutor. Right? Kind of now it's working. Comes and gets.
I'll put this one in front of you instead.
Okay.
There we go. I need to turn up long now.
Okay. You've been reading it anyway. One day the heavenly beings came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan, the prosecutor, who was part of the divine council, he was elected there too, or not elected, appointed, came with them, and the Lord said to the prosecutor, where have you come from? And the prosecutor answered the Lord, from going to and fro on the earth and from walking up and down on it. And the Lord said to the prosecutor, have you considered my servant Job? There's no one like him on the earth, like it's a very positive picture of Job. Then the prosecutor said, "Stretch out your hand now and touch all that he has, and he'll curse you to your face." And the Lord said to the prosecutor, "Very well." So the prosecutor went out from the presence of the Lord. Now, what this is doing with the issue of suffering is it's saying it's not necessarily the case that you suffer because you're bad. You may be suffering because God set up a test and Satan is testing you on God's behalf. That's what the Job story is saying. It's not a terribly satisfactory answer, but it was an instance of grappling with the whole issue. Another solution in the interim was to say, well, look, some suffering is not punishment because I'm bad. It's suffering, like it's happening. And so they began to think about Israel as God's servant suffering, and they pictured this individual figure suffering, called the suffering servant, and said, well, this person's suffering somehow releases a positive impact on the rest of us, like it's almost suffering on our behalf. It's the familiar passage that we know from Easter, which, because it gets then later applied to Jesus, but originally it was about Israel, pictured as a person. He was despised and rejected by others, a man of suffering and acquainted with infirmity. The Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. So there's a sense in which this person is taking the punishment for others. I'm not sure how satisfactory that is, but it was the will of the Lord to crush him with pain. When you make his life an offering for sin, he shall see his offspring and shall prolong his days, and through him the will of the Lord shall prosper. Now here, priests are thinking about Israel suffering and saying, actually, it's not because we're bad. There's another purpose in it. Like they were grappling for an understanding of suffering and what God had to do with it. It was kind of a plan of God for the suffering to take place. You probably are all familiar with the explanation that says, you know, there's a bookmark that's embroidered. You look on the back of it, it's a real mess, but it's a plan. And God has, you've got the suffering, that's God's plan. And one day you'll turn it round and you'll see what it was all about. And some people find that really helpful. But it really doesn't make a lot of sense. The divine plan embroidery. What then develops, and we're getting nearer to the New Testament time, and when I reach the end of the Old Testament, I'll stop and we can have, you know, any questions you might have. The new solution is to say, look, God allows interim chaos. God allows things to happen. People fall over and hurt themselves. Battles take place. It's not God manipulating it or God's manipulating it. It's what happens in the world. Like it's a form of atheism, not atheism, but not theism. Not everything's controlled by gods and by God. It's a bit chaotic in this world. So it begins, this kind of thinking begins with Satan, the prosecutor in the book of Job. So it's not to be, suffering's not to be explained because Job's bad. Some other things are operating. And of course, what develops then is the myth in Genesis 6, which comes to be a key. Now, it's a myth. The angels, the male angels are all male for ancient world prejudice. They see women on earth, they fall in love with them, they have sexual relations with them. And as a result, the women have babies who are half heavenly and half earthly, and they are giants. So Where did the giants come from? Now, I know this sounds like bedtime stories, but this is one of the ancient myths. So giants came about because angels slept with women and they shouldn't have. The giants then fought each other, and out of their corpses came spirits that were half human and half divine. And they now flood the world in which we live. They're everywhere. And when they talked about this myth, they gave these spirits names, and the names they gave were names of illnesses. So there would be a COVID spirit. Yeah? In a way, this was a major development scientifically. It was a realization that there are random things that happen in our world. There are forces, influences. We don't personalize them as they did. They talked about spirits, personal, but we know them as viruses, bacteria. We know them as random things that happen in our world. It's, in that sense, chaotic. It's the natural world in which we live. And what developed was an awareness that this is the state of how things are. Creation is the arena for conflicting forces of evil spirits, demons, leading nations, bringing about illness and so forth. They also believed that most forces of nature were also produced by demons and spirits, like storms. So it's not surprising that when Jesus is pictured as stilling the storm, he addresses it. Because the assumption of people in those days was that there was a spirit that was controlling it, needed to be told to stop. This was very widespread in the ancient world. So creation is in a state of brokenness, and there are ongoing consequences. It's a bit chaotic. Now, where does God fit into this? It's an interesting question. And God is kind of involved, but involved in helping us deal with the chaos. I'm going to stop at this point and ask if there are any questions. We've been going through the Old Testament material, and we've got through to the time of the New Testament. It assumes the interim chaos theory. And Jews who held to this theory, and I've not said this, but let me add this, that the understanding was we are in this chaotic state with these demons and things, personalized viruses. One day it'll all be stopped and there will be a new heaven and a new earth. Like the thinking is, smash it all up and start again. A new creation, a new beginning. That's the only hope. This is the dominant thinking that's around when we move towards the time of Jesus, and it's important for understanding his ministry. Now, I've taken you through a history of ideas. Let me stop. I think maybe I'll go on from here and talk about the New Testament, which is, of course, Jesus was a Jew, and the first Christians were Jews, and then they spread into the wider non-Jewish world. So you can assume, and this is correct, that their assumptions, their beliefs about reality were Jewish understandings. Like we've just talked about exorcism. So God has chosen not to micromanage the present. That's the assumption of the New Testament writers and the New Testament tradition. And that's different from a view that says God is actually sitting at a computer, as it were, controlling all the events. No, the New Testament writers adopt they are part of the Jewish understanding that in fact, no, God is not a micromanager. Things happen, and that's simply the way it is. God's chosen not to micromanage. So the three elements that play a role here are that there are personalised evil forces, and they've got the freedom to operate, much as we believe in viruses. The human responsibility is to act and respond. So there is human responsibility. I'm not to blame for everything that happens, but I'm also not, uninvolved. I have a responsibility to deal with harm that I see happening in this chaotic world. They also believed in occasional divine interventions. So God doesn't micromanage, but steps in every now and again. This was their kind of understanding that we see reflected. So we may bring things on ourselves, but suffering is mostly ethically neutral, like you're not bad because you suffer. Now, we can say, yes, of course, there are still people who blame themselves because they suffer. This is still a problem. Somehow God's punishing me. Those ideas certainly were around, but it's not the New Testament way of God talk. They continue the Jewish hope that there will be a showdown in the future. And this has become part of our Christian faith. The kingdom of God, God's reign will come, Satan will be defeated, the evil spirits will be shut down. There'll be a new start, a new heaven and a new earth replacing the chaos. Now we have to think about what we do with that, but that's the assumption that informs the New Testament writers and the early church. There will be a judgment day. So just think about this. It's really not fair that those people who have been acting unjustly, exploitation and so forth, that they go to the end of their life and nobody holds them to account. It can't be. It's unfair. It's got to be sorted out. So the notion developed that it wasn't going to happen on this earth. The earlier idea, just wait and eventually they'll get punishment. No, it didn't happen. It's not the way it happened. We're in a real world. But one day they surely will have to face God. And so the notion of a judgment day developed where people will be held to account. It's only fair, surely. And you can understand that thinking, and it's got a lot to be said for it. However, you might like me to imagine it. And of course, for that purpose, they'll need to be there. So they'll need to have a body. And so the idea develops that people will be raised from the dead at the end of time, not with a physical body, but their physical body will be transformed into a kind of a ghost spiritual body. Otherwise they can't talk, they can't hear. You've got to have a body to do those things. That was Jewish understanding. No life without a body. So embodied people would then have to face up to the things that they had done. And then imaginations take off, of course. Those who are feeling vengeful will create pictures of how wonderful it will be when those people are getting punished. A lot of sick things develop, of course. But the notion of judgment, that there is going to be some sorting out, is kind of fundamental. What you find in the New Testament, especially coming from Jesus and others, is that they're not obsessed with the day of the Lord, the judgment day. They're actually engaged in something else, and that is saying, we're engaged with God in the interim. The Spirit of God, and they often spoke about the Spirit of God, especially because there was this notion that God was aloof in a way, but also connected. So they spoke about God's breath would come amongst us, God's Spirit, active in the present. And so you could see God's action where people were being liberated from the spirits which bound them. Now, whether you saw that in terms of exorcism or just as healing, there was an assumption that God is engaged and isn't sitting back looking at this chaotic situation saying, oh, how long will I let this go on for? So they began to develop more this idea that God is actually engaged in what's going on in the world. So Jesus talks about hope for the future, but also talks about hope for the present. And one of the striking things about Jesus was he said, look, what I'm doing, this is actually, made the claim, this is actually God's doing, God's reign, this is God's way, God's life happening amongst you. As an exorcist healer and as a radical prophet of God's generosity, inclusivity, good news for the poor. Like Jesus was a marketer, a representative, a channel for transformation already now. And then what you get people like Paul doing is saying, if anyone is in Christ, like if they've got into the Christ mold life, if they've let the Spirit of Christ come, there is a new creation, which was a very creative thing to do. Because traditionally people said the new creation somewhere down the track, coming soon. And Paul said, no, actually new creation can happen for people in the present. Very creative thinking. I'm going to go on to talk about some problems that arose and arise with talking about God. But I'm going to pause again and ask, are there any questions about the New Testament little bit that I did? All right, let's move on to this. There is a problem if we say that God chose not to micromanage. Are you saying that God could have stopped all that terrible suffering and just backed off? What would that say about God if you're thinking about God as like a person, a human being? Especially if you've got this notion that God implements plans, and so does sometimes control and intervene. If you think like that, why you've got a problem? Why doesn't God intervene when it's obviously necessary? There's terrible cruelty going on. Why doesn't God? Is there something wrong with God, or is there something wrong with our thinking about God when we think like that? So even the notion that one day it'll all be smashed up and we'll start again, there'll be a new creation. Why? Why not fix things up now? If your understanding of God is of a controller, is your picture of God as a responsible controller? What's going on? So these are some of the problems that we have when we think about God as controller, like a king in the ancient world. Well, another view is, of course, it is all planned by God and it's meant to be. Determinism, here's your predestination. It's rather difficult to marry that with the notion of recognising there are chaotic forces at work and that human beings are responsible for what's going on as well. But think about it from another point of view. If it's all meant to be, I just need to let it happen. A passive, non-stressing spirituality It's in the hands of the gods. Relax. Deep breathing. See, this is a philosophy too, of course. Yeah, this is a philosophy. It's tied in with the determinism. It's got more roots in Indian mysticism than it has in early Christianity or in our faith, but it's around. And you can see that there are health benefits. Just relax. Just let it happen. You might fall over like I nearly did. But the thing is, it's not all planned, unchangeable. There is limited opportunity to bring about change. And more seriously, you are not destined to be poor and to suffer. See, this view of determinism can lead to the view that, well, the poor are poor, that's their fate. It's their karma. Huh? There's something almost evil about that kind of thinking. It's a dangerous theology. But it's around because it's got an indirect benefit, especially if I'm not suffering, or if I'm only, if I'm doing relatively well, I'll just relax and accept things. I'm not going to get involved in social justice. I'm not going to get disturbed about what's happening to other people out there. That's their destiny. It's not the approach of Jesus. He got himself into trouble by reaching out to people who were alienated and who'd alienated themselves. Occasional divine interventions, we need to be skeptical about skepticism. We need to have an open mind that things happen sometimes. In the New Testament, you have stories about nature miracles, stilling storms. I mentioned that was understood as an exorcism. Jesus walking on water, miraculous feedings, temporary resuscitations, miraculous conception for somebody who was a virgin or somebody who way past menopause, nature miracles like that. They're talked about. And there are the healing miracles, the exorcisms, the disempowering of the harming spirits by word or spirit. These stories are there. Now, as modern people, we have different understandings of a lot of these things. We know that rainbows caused by refraction of light through moisture, and we don't actually think it was not in existence until God put it in the sky, as in the story of Noah. We have different explanations of things. We also read some of these stories, and it seems, because of their Old Testament content, the allusions, some of them are symbolic narratives. But there were stories about Jesus healing. I don't think there's any doubt about this, that he was an exorcist. These stories occurred. How significant were they? They were mostly seen as non-repeatable. And what happened, in certain circles of Christianity, what happened is that they got harnessed as arguments why you should follow Jesus. So in the marketplace of the persuasion of ideas, Christians could go and say, well, look, he did this and he did this, and all these wow factors follow him. We can see that some of the stories, say the ones that come into John's Gospel, will have been used like this. So if you think about it, then the message becomes, join our movement because our founder did these fantastic things, more fantastic than your founder. And they'll say, but our founder did pretty fantastic things too. And the emperor, part of the political propaganda in those days, was to say the emperor was able to heal people and do, you know, in the marketplace of competing wow factors, there were Christian groups who were engaged in that. It became a little problematic when you started to make those things so central, as though God is to be identified where the magic or the miracle happens. This is sometimes called finding God in the gaps. Where we can't explain something, we say it's an act of God. You know, insurance policies still have reference to an act of God. So, you know, so what happens is that where you can't explain something, okay, it must be God. And people can say, well, you know, new science is saying at the very subatomic level, things are random, so it's quite possible that God is involved in doing this or doing that. So you can argue about the feasibility of miracles. You don't always have to be sceptical about it. But the problem with the God of the gaps is that the more you explain, the less room there is for God. So the God of the gaps is a diminishing return. You know, it really doesn't work. Or, well, it can work to a certain degree, but you know, the more we understand, we know that actually storms are caused by all kinds of complicated things, including El Nino and whatever. We know how rainbows are made. We don't need the God explanation for those anymore. This was a major problem in early Christianity. Those who marketed Jesus on the basis of the wow factor. Now they didn't deny miracles, but they said, this is not the way. So it's really interesting. And Paul and Matthew and Mark and John, they shift the focus away from the fantastic. And you know Paul's celebrated way of doing this in 1 Corinthians 13. I may perform miracles, I may do this, I may do that. If I don't have love, it's just a lot of, you know, it's nothing. So what Paul argued was the real sign of the presence of God is love. And he elsewhere talks about the fruit of the Spirit is love. It's fascinating that in so many of the New Testament writings, this issue is confronted. Matthew in the Sermon on the Mount at the end says, well, in that day, at the judgment day, many will come and say, look, we've performed great miracles in your name. And Jesus will say, I didn't know you. You missed the point. You were into the wow factor. Mark is similar. Mark actually portrays Jesus as lowly going to the cross and says, well, the Son of Man didn't come to be served, but to serve and to give his life. Like the Son of Man, Jesus representing God, is saying my priorities are not winning, but loving. And the Gospel, according to John, is quite striking because it has used a collection of miracles that have been wound up for propaganda purposes. And what he does, in the end of chapter 2, 23 to 25, by the way, comes just before chapter 3, which is going to be the reading for next Sunday. I wish people preaching on it would use those verses because without them you don't understand the Nicodemus episode. So what happens is that John says many people believed on his name, that was the term for becoming a believer, because of the mighty works that he did. And he did not believe in them. Which is really striking. Because he knew what was in people. He didn't need people to tell him. The Greek goes straight on. And there was a guy, Nicodemus, who came along and said, you must be from God because look at the things you do. And what did Jesus say to him? That kind of faith's not what I'm about. You need to be born from above. You need to be a different kind of person. The Nicodemus episode is not about pagans and Christians. It's about correct faith. So John's gospel does wonderful things. It says, look, okay, we don't deny the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. Problematic as that is, we would love to be able to do it in many parts of the world today, and we can't. So it's in that sense irrelevant. It's highly symbolic. But John says, look, you need to understand Jesus as the bread of life, the inner nourishment that you can have. He's the one who offers the water of life. Okay, he healed a blind man. You need to understand he's the light of the world who will lead you out of the darkness of hate into love. So John's gospel does wonderful things in that way. It's a correction. Of course, one of the big challenges was the cross of Jesus. I mean, we know why it happened historically. It's because he was seen as a subversive, like many others, just happened to be not one with force of arms, but by force of ideas, and the imperial authorities killed him. That's what they did. It's the best way to tidy things up. Just don't let a movement get out of hand. So they crucified him. They didn't need to round up his disciples because they didn't have arms. But that should have squashed the movement. And then, of course, what happened was that faith said love has not been killed. And the story of the resurrection, Jesus into a new form of existence that appears and disappears after Easter, foreshadowing hope, was fundamental to their saying, we're with Jesus. We're with this understanding of love. Coming to terms, though, with what happened before that, namely his death, was a real problem. He died because he was bad? No, clearly that old system doesn't work. So the righteous in the Psalms sometimes talk about suffering, just something that happens to them, and they cry out, my God, why have you forsaken me? They mock me. I'm suffering. Wonderful psalms with lots of empathy. And of course, when they told the story of Jesus' crucifixion, they used that psalm to say, well, Jesus suffered like the righteous in the past suffered. He was killed the way they killed the prophets as well. They also, the idea, it was planned, it was foretold somehow. So that's a kind of trying to get back to some control of the event. One of the other things that they did was to say, well, it had an impact. It was like a sacrifice. When you performed a sacrifice in the ancient world, it kind of had an overflow of positive influence, and that's what we see from the death of Jesus. So they began to say Jesus died like a sacrifice. There were all kinds of other theories that developed from that, and some of them are appalling, like it kind of went awry. I mean, some of them are along the lines of, well, God really wanted to love, but really felt that there was a punishment that had to be paid, so he decided to punish his son instead of punishing us. An appalling thought. But, this is what people kind of did. But then what people have come to see is that, look, his death was what his life was. It was vulnerability, is giving himself. And that's what can happen when you give yourself. So God on the cross, it's a kind of vulnerability. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a famous German theologian who was executed by the Nazis, a minister, he wrote a number of things. One of the things he said was, look, the vision of God that can help us is the God who is suffering, the God who joins us in the pain
the God on the cross. Now, in his context, he was saying, that's what actually helps us. Yeah? It was really quite profound. It's easy to talk about miraculous things if you're in a little community and small world, but it raises all sorts of ethical issues. And of course, the major confrontation of some traditional ideas of God came about with the Holocaust, with 6 million Jews being gassed. This was all part of God's plan. No, it wasn't. It was an evil thing that happened. Where was God in it? The God who controls is dead, was the conclusion that people drew. The God who is compassionate is alive and suffering, and was there suffering in their midst. That's a different way of thinking about God. It actually puts compassion rather than power at the heart of our thinking of God. That God is dead. And particularly in the 1960s and 70s, this was a thought that came up. People were beginning to realise we actually need to revisit our understanding of God because some of the things we've said don't make sense. There's value in having our thinking challenged, and there are things that we don't understand, and we need to be flexible and allow ourselves to be stopped on our tracks, because we're talking about God, and God is bigger than a human being. We need to be open and flexible. God is beyond human models of, we make God in our own image. Some of the problems we've had is that we have thought about God as like a human being. Yeah? I don't know how other to talk of God than to talk of God as a person, but God is more than a person. I mean, we're sitting here, we're in Australia, we're on the planet Earth, we're in a solar system. There are millions of solar systems in the galaxy. There are millions of galaxies. It goes back 13.6 billion years. How can I imagine that the one who's behind all of this is just a big Bill Loader or a big... I mean, that's pathetic. So some of our problems come because of the image of God that we have. None of our images is adequate. In the universe of the womb, there's security. It's all under control. It's wonderful, the universe of the womb. In the womb of the nursery, there's also control and belonging, security through parenting, mother, father. It's a bit more fragile because it doesn't always work. So what happens to that sense of belonging and security that I had in the womb? Well, I carry it with me as a hope, part of my physiology, of my mental state. And in the womb of childhood, control lies with and beyond parents. And I discover the chaos of fallibility because my mum and dad aren't always right. Help. Is there hope and belonging? Is there order? Is there security? In the universe of growing up, control lies beyond the mix of human good and evil. Is there order and belonging? And as mature adults, there aren't any controls. There's just people and an evolving universe. Is there? Is what I was born with defunct? Is there order and belonging in the vast womb of the universe? Or is that just a projection governed by my inner psyche? It might be. I make it up. People of faith say, no, it's not fantasy, it's reality. We believe that there is love at the centre of the universe in the being of God. Prove it. Can't. It's a choice to believe that. The notion of God as a male, a rich male lord, as in the ancient world, controlling all and wanting to be adored, is in many ways a pathetic picture. Find it in our hymns, you'll find it pretty easily. God is not male or female, these are small, inadequate categories. God is beyond our images. God is mainly absent above, dropping down occasionally, or sending angels? Or is God in it all, in nature, there for you and me to encounter? God in human relations, God in compassion and human need, God in care for creation. So if you stop thinking about God as a big man person, and you think about God in the stretch of what we haven't got the capacity to even grasp, namely the extent of the universe, then some of these things become different and possible. So for me, it's been moving from an understanding of creation as an arena of evil spirits with occasional divine interventions and human initiatives, looking to its replacement, like biblical theism. For me, it's been a move to see creation as the arena of human initiatives, good and evil, and natural forces, and sensing the presence of God, engaging in oneness with God within it. So I'm really going to, this is the last slide, I'll just sum up some things. For me, God is a faith response to reality. Its beginning, its middle and its end. Absolutely fundamental for my existence. And it's something I want for everyone. Not for them to be religious, but for them to be what they were made to be. It's to be natural, to be connected to the universal God. God and love as intellectual and existential interpretation. What I mean by that is you decide about whether God is loving or whether it is all a big random chaos. That's harder to think, actually, than that there is ultimately behind it all some purpose, some one, personal but bigger than personal. And is the God of the universe a monster? You could argue that that's the case, but I want to embrace the simplicity of Jesus, who talked about God as loving as a parent. I dare to believe that. We can believe it. God-relatedness as seeking to be one with God in the universe, which means involvement in peace and justice and creativity. So God, not outside of, but within the complexities and causalities of life. Now, that's my faith. You can see that it's built on some critical thinking about other models of God. It may not gel for you, but the aim in offering this session is to have some time for thinking about how we talk about God. We can't define God. God's beyond our comprehension, but we can think about what we say. and sing. So any comments or questions that you have?